She took a job cooking for a crew of strange cowboys. It was her last chance to escape a shameful past. She had no idea that the quietest man among them, the one always watching her from the shadows, was no hired hand. He was the owner of the very ranch itself, and he had known who she was long before she ever spoke a word. Now her every day on this land depended on the silence of a man, unaware that she was already in the palm of his hand. December didn't just arrive in Montana, it laid siege. The snow fell without a sound, but its weight was enough to break the exhausted branches of trees and cover the plains in a white blanket, as cold as a final farewell. The wind howled through the gaps of the Stone River Ranch, each gust a razor blade scraping against bare skin. Into that place May walked. Her coat was thin, frayed at the elbows, her gloves a strange patchwork of wool and leather. But those things could not hide the woman herself. A spine as straight as forged iron, and eyes that burned with a defiant fire that only women with nothing left to lose possess. She stopped before the cookhouse, where a group of cowboys was gathered around an open flame, passing a flask and laughing low through chattering teeth. Their laughter died, like a flame suddenly snuffed out as they saw her, a woman, alone, in this desolate place. A tall man, his beard flecked with gray and suspicion etched deep into his brow, stepped forward. His voice was the sound of dry gravel rolling in his throat. "This is a working ranch, miss. Not a place for strays or sad stories." "I am not a stray," May replied, her voice low and steady. "And I'm not here to tell stories." The man looked her up and down, his gaze contemptuous. "We have no use for trouble, nor for liars or women who think they can use sweet talk to trade for a warm spot by the fire." May's jaw set. "I'm not here for sweet talk either." Another man, with a meaner look in his eyes, spat onto the frozen ground. "Looks like she came from a saloon kitchen, if not the back room." A ripple of crude laughter followed. The older man raised a hand to silence it, then stepped closer until their faces were nearly touching. "Then what do you want?" May met his stare without blinking. "I can cook," she said, her voice as sharp as a shard of flint. "I can work a cast iron pan over a fire, skin a rabbit, make sourdough in a snowstorm, and soup from bones. I can feed your men with what's left in the barrel and make them say thank you afterward." There was a pause, with only the crackle of the fire behind them. "Where are you from?" he asked. May didn't answer. He leaned in closer. "This ain't no place for secrets." She lifted her chin. "I know how to cook, and I'm not turning back." The man studied her a moment longer, then stepped aside, nodding toward the cookhouse. "We've got 36 mouths to feed through this winter, and not a decent meal in 2 days. The stove is in there. By morning, show us you're worth more than empty words." May didn't flinch. "I'll need flour, salt, a dry towel. And a little respect wouldn't kill you." The man's lips twisted into half a smile. "We'll see about that last part." As May walked toward the door, her gaze swept over the group one last time. Most looked away, a few smirked. But one man didn't move. He leaned against a post, arms folded, tall in a dark coat and a brimmed hat pulled low. The only thing visible was the sharp cut of his jaw and an unreadable flicker in his eyes. He didn't speak, didn't scoff like the others. He just stood there, watching silently. May's gaze met his, a moment that stretched longer than it should have, before she pushed open the cookhouse door and stepped inside. Inside, the air was cold and thick with the smell of old grease. But in the center of the room, the cast-iron stove stood tall, a dark and steadfast fortress. May felt something, like a stubborn hope, stir in her chest. She hung her satchel on a hook, rolled up her sleeves, and began. Dawn had not yet chased the darkness from the hills when May awoke. The cold bit into her marrow as she put on her threadbare coat and pulled on her boots. Snow had drifted against the cookhouse door, and it took her shoulder and a hard shove to open it. Inside, the air was colder than it was outside. She didn't hesitate. She chipped ice from the water barrel, coaxed a fire to life with dry pine kindling, and waited patiently. Soon, the iron heart of the stove began to beat, its heat chasing the white fog of her breath from the air. Her fingers were numb, her back ached, but she moved like a woman who was used to worse and was determined to keep living. The first meal was a test. Slices of salt pork fried slow in a cast-iron skillet until the fat rendered golden and sizzling. The biscuits were hard and rough at the edges, but hot and smelling of flour. The coffee was thick, strong enough to wake the dead dot at first. The men just grumbled. One asked where the real cook was. Another laughed loudly, saying she must have poisoned the beans. But by the third morning, they were on the benches early. The plates were scraped clean, and the coffee pot was passed around like a treasure. Not a single word of praise was spoken, but they ate every last crumb dot, and they worked in silence, efficiently. She scrubbed the pans herself, wiped down the table, and swept the ash from the corners when no one asked her to, and Caleb was always there. He always came before the others. He never said much, just stepped into the cookhouse at the same hour each morning, lifted the heavy logs into the firebox without being asked, and left as quietly as he arrived. She would nod her thanks. He would just tip the brim of his hat. In return, he avoided her eyes. May noticed. He spoke with the others, sat with them at meals, but with her, there was a silence. Not the silence of judgment, but the silence of distance, as if he were holding something back behind his eyes and didn't trust it to stay hidden if she looked for too long. And yet, he was the only one who carried an extra bucket of water when no one told him to. The only one who left a new bar of soap by the wash basin when hers had worn thin. The only one who straightened the icy step after seeing her slip once near the woodpile dot. It was a strange kindness, wordless but steady, one evening. As May was hauling a bucket of melted snow across the frozen yard, her boot caught on a slick patch of ice. She fell hard, the bucket flying from her grip, water splashing across the white ground. The fall knocked the breath from her chest, a sharp pain spiking up her wrist. She hissed, biting her lip to keep from crying out, before she could even sit. Up, a pair of arms were around her shoulders. Caleb. He had crossed the yard faster than a thought. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. May blinked, his face so close, framed by the dark brim of his hat. His hands were warm through his gloves, holding her steady. She nodded, her breath shallow. "I'm fine." He helped her to her feet, one hand on her elbow, the other supporting her back. When she was upright, he stepped back immediately, as if he had just stepped over an invisible line and was trying to return before it cost him too much. May looked at him. He looked away. "Thank you," she said softly. He only nodded, then turned back toward the barn without another word. That night, as she sat by the stove cleaning the scrape on her palm, she thought about the way he had looked at her, as if she were someone he recognized but could not name aloud. He carried himself like a man keeping his distance, not out of disdain, but out of fear or perhaps guilt. May had known many kinds of silence in her life, but Caleb's silence was different, and she couldn't help but wonder what it was he was so afraid to say. It didn't begin with a shout, but with a whisper. Red Callahan, a brash young cowboy with a sharp eye and a constant thirst for trouble, had returned from town. He waited until supper, when the fire was burning bright and the men's bellies were full, before he spat his venom, wrapped in a joke. "I've seen her before," he said, nodding toward the cookhouse where May was working alone, in Billings, at the Rosebell. That name settled over the camp like a layer of ash. Everyone knew the Rosebell, a brothel that posed as a saloon, with velvet curtains, cheap whiskey, and girls who always had to smile whether they wanted to or not. Red grinned, his teeth yellowed. She wore an apron, then too, always smelled of sage and smoke. A cook, sure, but you know how those women get. Pulled upstairs as soon as the whiskey runs low. A few men chuckled, some uncomfortably, others with the cruel ease born of boredom and bitter winters. No one questioned Red. They just let his words take root. May didn't hear them that night, but she felt them the next morning. The Cowboys. Filed in for breakfast slower than usual. Their eyes darted elsewhere. The daily clatter of metal and conversation was gone. They were still polite, but they were no longer kind, and May knew. She knew that look, the lowered voices, the way good men become strangers once they think they know a piece of your past. Her hands still worked to the same rhythm, stirring the pot of beans, slicing the bacon, serving the coffee. But her shoulders had stiffened. The thin but real smile she sometimes wore was gone. She had learned long ago that defending yourself too hard only made you seem guiltier. Let them talk. She had survived worse. Caleb had heard it too. He hadn't laughed when Red made his comments. He didn't look amused or curious. He had just gone silent, staring into the fire as if the answer to a battle he had long been struggling with lay within it. That afternoon, when Red made another crude remark, something about leftover women and leftover stew, Caleb moved. No warning, no growl. Just a fast, clean punch, the impact as dry and sharp as thunder. Red hit the ground, spitting blood, stunned. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted. Caleb said nothing. He stood over Red for a moment, fists clenched, chest heaving. Then he turned and walked away, not saying a word, not looking at anyone, including May, who had witnessed the whole thing from the shadows of the cookhouse doorway. That night, snow began to fall, soft and steady, like ash from a high place. May stayed up later than usual. She sat near the warm stove, her fingers tight around a chipped mug of tea she had saved from her own wages. She didn't know what to make of what she had seen. Why had Caleb hit Red? The sound at the door came after 10, so soft it was barely there. May stood slowly, her heart tight, and opened it. There was no one outside. Only the snow, and a small basket on the stoop. Inside were a dozen brown eggs, still warm from the hen, and a sack of cornmeal wrapped carefully in cloth, tied tight with a rough twine. No note, no name, but she knew. The eggs were from the roost. Near the barn, Caleb's chore. The cornmeal bore the mark of the general store in town. The same trip Red had returned from. May knelt in the doorway, brushing a flake of snow from the basket's edge. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to smile, just a little. She didn't understand him, not yet. But perhaps tonight, she didn't have to. Tonight, someone had quietly remembered her worth without demand, and that was enough. The fire in the stove had long gone out, but Caleb could not sleep. He lay on his narrow cot in the bunkhouse, eyes open to the darkness, listening to the wind thread through the cracks in the walls like a whispered warning. Outside, the snow laid a soft and soundless blanket over the plains, but inside his chest, memory was a branding iron, burning hot. 3 years ago, the Rosebell in Billings. That night had never left him. He remembered the smell of cheap perfume mingled with the stale air of bourbon and sweat. And he remembered her. She didn't look like the others. No bright lipstick, no hungry smile. She wore an apron, her hair pulled back neatly, quietly carrying a tray of drinks, trying to move like a ghost, but then the floor had been wet. She slipped, the tray crashed. A wealthy merchant roared with rage. "Filthy saloon tramp," he'd spat. Another man had yanked the strings of her apron. She staggered, her hands shaking. But then she straightened herself, her eyes. He never forgot her eyes. They looked right at them, unflinching, defiant, and he had done nothing. Caleb had just stood there, his fists clenched in his pockets, his mouth as dry as if it were filled with sand. He was old enough to know what was right, and too cowardly to do it. He saw that woman now. The woman who rose at dawn to cook for men who wouldn't even meet her gaze. The woman who scrubbed the cookhouse with her aching hands and never asked for a word of thanks. Caleb sat up, his bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor. He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the night. And then the fire came. It started with a stray ember, carried by a cruel gust of wind from the north into a pile of dry timber someone had stacked too close to the back of the cookhouse. Within minutes, the flame roared, climbing the wooden wall with a terrible fury. Shouts broke the night. Men scrambled from the bunkhouse. But May, exhausted, had fallen asleep on the small cot near the stove. Caleb didn't wait. He didn't call out. He crashed through the door, tore through the thick smoke, pulled his coat over her, and lifted her into his arms, turning his own back to the flames licking down the wall. Sparks caught on his sleeves, the heat seared his cheek, but he held her close and did not stop. When she woke, coughing against his chest, her eyes opened to his face. His face was so close, raw and pained. He looked down at her, and in that gaze there was no shame, no memory of where they had met, no past. Only the now. Only the girl he had once failed, and the woman he refused to fail again. After the fire was put out, leaving a black scar on the side of the camp, he brought her into the main house. He placed a bowl of hot soup on the table. Silence. Finally, she looked up, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "Why?" He let out a long, slow breath. "Because I owe you." He told her everything. About that night at the Rosebell, about his silence. And then he said the last thing, the heaviest thing. "My name is Caleb Stone." May blinked. Stone, like Stone River Ranch. Her face went still. "So all this time," she said, her voice low, "you've been watching from behind a mask." "No," he said, stepping closer. "I was trying to earn your truth with mine." Her breath hitched. He continued, softer. "I didn't lie. I just didn't lead with a name that had never fed a horse or built a fire." She turned away, looking out the window where the snow had stopped but the cold pressed closer. Caleb waited. Finally, she turned back to the soup on the table. "It's hotter than usual," she said. "But it cools fast." Caleb sat down slowly, picking up the spoon. With a gentleness she had never seen, he said, "So do most things worth waiting for." May said nothing, but she did not leave the room, and she did not turn away again. The dawn was a pale smear across the ridge, barely strong enough to break the long shadows of the night. May packed her belongings into a canvas satchel. Her hands moved with a practiced silence, folding her one spare apron, tying a scarf around her hair, tucking the leather-bound cookbook under her arm. She left the fire in the stove untended, the coals cold from the night before. The crunch of her boots on the frozen ground was the only sound to break the stillness. Even the horses had not yet begun their restless stamping. Only the wind whispered. Like a regret, May paused by the cookhouse door, her gaze sweeping over the porch where Caleb sometimes stood before sunrise, pretending to sip coffee. There was no sign of him. She let out a breath. Her heart didn't ache. It burned as if something were being torn from the bone. The shelves still held her jars of pickled onions, her spices wrapped in wax paper, but they were not hers. This place had never been hers. It was always someone else's ranch, someone else's fire. She left the key a bent nail on a string hooked beside the stove. And she walked away. Caleb did not sleep that night. Snow had begun to fall again, dry and restless, thin flurries that caught in his hair and melted on his collar. He had stood outside the dark cookhouse for hours, watching the smokeless chimney, the still windows. He said nothing when she left, not because he didn't want to stop her. He didn't stop her because he knew how many men had tried to cage her with soft words. He would not be another. Instead, he waited until her figure had vanished, then stepped into the cookhouse, now hollowed by silence. He went to the narrow table that May had scrubbed clean each morning and reached for the old book she always kept. Near the flour sacks, her mother's recipes. Her dream. He hesitated, then tore a blank page from the back. The letter was short, but it cost him more than anything he had ever spoken aloud. If I could be someone else, if time could be rewound like a reel of thread, I would have been the man who knelt to wipe that floor for you, not the man who stood and watched and turned away. You stood taller than I ever have. You still do. I do not ask you to forgive me, only to know this. When you stepped into my fire, it was the first time I felt warm. Caleb folded the letter carefully, slid it inside the front cover of the cookbook, and left it on the edge of the kitchen table, where she would not miss it if she ever came back. But he did not expect her to. May found the letter on the third night. She had only made it as far as a boarding house in town, her savings just enough for a small cot and cold tea for 1 week. The cookbook had been tucked in her bag, unread until now. She was trying to write down a new soup recipe on the last page when she felt the thin edge of paper slide free. She unfolded the letter slowly, read it twice, then pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. Outside, the snow howled against the thin window panes, the wind screaming like a storm without end. But inside her, something had softened, not the pain. The pain would take time, but the belief that maybe, just maybe, not every man was too late. Some just needed a fire they could not ignore. The sun poured a golden light over the Montana plains, slow and gentle, warming the wooden beams of a small building nestled beside the old trail. Above the door, a carved wooden sign swayed in the breeze. May's table. Inside, the air always smelled of cinnamon and smoked pork. The long shelves along the walls held not just books, but jars of colorful preserves. And behind the wooden counter, where a fresh pie sat every morning, was always May. Her hands were steady now, her laughter easy. She no longer flinched at loud voices or heavy boots. She wore her apron with pride and kept a painted tin box by the window labeled Dreams, where she taught local girls how to save for the things that mattered. Outside, in the herb garden, Caleb worked, his sleeves rolled up, his hands covered in soil. He spoke to the basil like an old friend and trimmed the tomato plants with the care of a man who understood what it meant to start over. He still didn't say much, but when he looked at May, his gaze was without shame or shadow. Sometimes a stranger, a traveler who had caught wind of the place, would lean across the counter and ask, "Ma'am, you sure cook like you've been doing this forever. Where did you learn?" May would wipe her hands on her apron, glance at Caleb chopping onions behind her, and smile. "I used to cook for drunks who never knew my name," she'd say. "But now I cook for a man who looks me in the eye, and that is enough." Their wedding day was small and quiet. The meadow was still, lit by the late spring sun, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. May wore a dress she had sewn herself, nothing fancy, just cream-colored linen and a blue ribbon Caleb had found in an old drawer. He wore his best shirt and his quiet smile. They stood beneath a crooked oak tree, with 2 witnesses and a preacher who barely cleared his throat before he began. But the moment of silence lingered longer than any sermon dot at the end. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. Not lace, not silk, just soft cotton, embroidered with a single word in faded red thread. "Forgiven." He tied it gently around May's wrist, like a vow that needed no voice. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with something that had nothing to do with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head. "No," he said. "Thank you for staying when I gave you every reason not to." They turned together toward the trail, hand in hand, the sunlight catching the embroidery on her wrist. They didn't have to run anymore. They had built something that could not be burned, not by fire, not by shame, not even by memory. And that That was the beginning of everything. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, there are more waiting. Hit that subscribe button